Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the listeners of the Book Talkies. Today is a very personal and humbling episode for us. It's about it's about our guest speaker who has been a very strong supportive pillar for us since our first episode. I would like to introduce Satyarth Mishra, who is the CEO of Digiruption, based out of Melbourne, Australia. Satyarth, on this note, let me welcome you to the Book Talkies show and thank you for accepting our request to be the guest speaker.
It's an absolute pleasure, Kaustubh and Anirudh. Thank you for persisting. It's been, I don't want to be placating your egos, but it's been an experience seeing you think about this concept and then actually coming up with and executing this very conversational mode of talking books in the era where people look for gratification even when it comes to reading. So I've been a great follower of the Book Talkies, and needless to say, it piques my interest, and it is also a great digression from the drudgery of the work that we do. So I should thank you guys for putting this show together, and I intend to be a supporter throughout its journey and assist wherever I can.
Thank you very much, Satyarth. And you have a very interesting book that you picked up, and the book's title is "Say Nothing: A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland," authored by Patrick Radden Keefe. Before we get there, Satyarth, I have been very inspired with your leadership style. So my first question to you would be, first of all, just introduce yourself and maybe kind of tease back into what does leadership mean to you, how you have become such a true mentor and such a true leader in your field.
I'm not sure I can stack up to any of the virtues you ascribed to me, Kaustubh. But look, in very simple terms, I have been in the business of technology for about 28, 29 years. Very fortunate, I've been itinerant, so I've traveled a fair bit, starting businesses in places where I've never previously been. So it's been very fortuitous, the kind of places I've visited, from the islands of Fiji to PNG to Indonesia to Singapore, Malaysia, and where I presently live in Melbourne. So it's been quite a journey, and I think it's all been serendipitous, and it cannot be subscribed to any special gift or talent that I have, because I'm just a gratuitous business developer in the world of technology. I was just thrown into it. That was a Hobson's choice. I took it, and I am now, I don't have an escape in that sense. So that will briefly describe me. Amongst other things, I am a student of history. I am a quasi-intellectual or an aspirant who attempts to see history through the eyes of those who lived the times. Also find, if wherever possible, some periodic trends, some periodic systemic underlying commonalities, whether it's the history of modern India. So interestingly, I'm a BA history graduate from Delhi University.
Yes.
Before I took my MBA, because one had to make a living, and that was the pathway into the life that we live, the families that we raise, etc., etc. When you asked me to name a book, this was the book that came to mind. And in part, ignorance sometimes is bliss. So I'll give you a very brief background. So I happened to speak with my son, who was visiting from the UK, where he was studying back in the day. And he had just been back from Dublin, where he was invited to adjudicate a debating competition. And I had always been intrigued by Dublin. So I asked him, I said, what is really happening? What's Northern Ireland? So this Father's Day, when he happened to visit home, he presented this book to me. That question probably lingered, and his father's ignorance stayed with him. So he got me this book, and he said, He's written a beautiful note, a very terse note, reminding me that history is forever to be cherished. And he got me Say Nothing from Patrick Radden Keefe. So the reading transports me to that world. At the age of 10, and I'm not trying to brag, but I had, thanks to my parents, about 1,000 books which I had read, and they had to buy a cupboard. So and most of them were in Hindi. We have a bit of a literary background from my mom's side. My father's side started reading at the age of 4. And that was because there used to be a magazine called Champak when we used to grow up in Hindi. And I used to ask my mother or father to read me just that one story again and again and again.
What I briefly sort of want to touch upon this book and the title of the book to start with. I was hearing an interview of the author yesterday on YouTube. There's a hour-long video which very touches upon what this book is about, but then also why he specifically picked up this name. So just wanted to get your perspective. Say Nothing. It, in my understanding, is about British oppression in Northern Ireland and how the Irish Republican Army really pushed back. And it's about the history of how Northern Ireland continued to be a part of United Kingdom, and then there was the Republic of Ireland also created towards the south. So just want to get your perspective at a high level. If I have covered, and I don't want to steal your thunder here, right? But have is this everything in the book, or is there more to it? And why the title Say Nothing?
Your research makes this very worthwhile because my conundrum or dilemma prior to jumping on this was, how do I structure the conversation? There's so much. There's 400 pages of history chronicled by this outstanding man who is of Irish descent and who grew up in Boston, right? I discovered this only towards the end of the book. Okay, so I've made some notes on my email draft, and
Super.
I would just love to walk you through that so that we have some sort of a context. Also, a couple of disclaimers. Look, I may be off on certain pronunciations, which I can be quite pedantic about, but I have a long way to go. So I may have mispronounced certain words. I may mix up some of the dates. Now this is history and not fiction. Look, in effect, Say Nothing the narrative starts in the 1970s. It's set in Belfast. It has exceptional protagonists. It's a somewhat rambling account of how Ireland got structured, devolved over the years, and it then talks about the key developments, incidents, milestones, and events through the description of its key protagonists, of which there are many, but a few stand out. So it was the 12th century when England first established its presence in Ireland. And the second milestone was, religion always played a very critical part in shaping Ireland, like in many other countries. Between 15th and 16th century, under Protestant British rule, there was a systemic confiscation of Irish land, dispossessing Irish people of their land. And that land was annexed by the colonists from Britain, Wales, etc.
Okay.
Right? So the unrest that has lingered and festered has been, from the onset of this 15th, 16th century, wrongful acquisition and annexation of land by the British. A constant theme is a conflict between Protestants and Catholics. After the 12th century, I think it was the 14th century, when a Protestant king ruled. And as usual, there was a divide between these sectors of Christianity, as I call them, and then Protestant rule was established. So the vestiges of that religious dichotomy and difference still define Ireland as of 2023. There was also a famine in 1840. It's called the Irish Potato Famine, which resulted in 2 million deaths, and not dissimilar to the Bengal famine, where the British government chose to allocate supplies elsewhere. So these are these are some of the historical bookmarks, if you like, which have to be kept in cognizance when we read up. So, and it was in the year 1921 when the British decided that they will, I mean, this is akin to the divide and rule policy, which we see in other parts of the world, including the
Right.
subcontinent. And 1921 is when they announced that Northern Ireland will continue to be a colony of the British, and the rest of Ireland will be independent. It is noteworthy that Northern Ireland had a majority population of Protestants who aligned with the British. It was 1 million Protestants and 500,000 Catholics. And what typically happened was the Catholics were alienated because they didn't have the same rights as the Protestants, who were British sympathizers. And that led to the formation of IRA, which was the Irish Republican Army, who fought the Protestants. There were a few outfits that Protestants were also organized under, guided under. But also there was the iron hand of the British, which still ruled Northern Ireland as a colony. What was striking was that both the colonial oppressor and the one colonized, they have certain instruments that have played out to be the same, whether it's the history of, whether it's independence of what's modern India or people elsewhere. There are some striking, uncanny similarities. So when you talk about the colonialists, the oppressors, they have always focused on divide and rule, surveillance as an instrument, spying, espionage, unlawful detention of people. We still see a few remnants of the colonial instruments in, say, we are all familiar with the Prevention of Terrorist Acts, right, POTA, which is still being used in certain parts of the world for unlawful detention of people. I'm told some political prisoners are nearing about 1,000 days in prison in some parts of the world. I don't mean to be cheeky, but so the instruments of the fascist and colonial are pretty much the same right across history. Whether you look at the subcontinent, whether you look at Ireland, which has unfortunately sort of protracted, and whether you look at the history of the United States of America. So this is something that stuck me. Also, the convert.
So Satyarth, one interesting thing while you talked about the similarities, I was also reading somewhere that hunger strike as a tool of passive aggression was another very important and critical thing from an IRA's perspective. They actually ended up.
My words, absolutely.
Okay, keep perfect, going, brilliant. So then you keep going then.
So no, we are. I'm having so much fun. Thank you for all the research that you did. So from the instruments of the oppressor to the instruments of the oppressed, you are 100% spot on. I mean, they are very similar. They're striking in their commonality. So marches, walks, fasting. When you talk about civil disobedience, they are not only limited to, say, the Indian freedom struggle. It's been the same in Africa. It's been the same in Ireland. So the Irish struggle obviously was dichotomized between violence and non-violence, and it fused seamlessly sometimes. But it is all. I think the way I see it, it's a potpourri of reactions, of a lack of homogeneity, reactions from a populace which is oppressed, which doesn't have the modern means to comprehend how the oppressor is going about it. So marches, fasting, and a certain steely resolve or grit, and I intend to quickly, I've underlined some sentences in the book which are very, very moving. In fact, this has been such a ride that, it's shaken me up many a times. I've had tears in my eyes. I've had indignation, becoming of a protester from time to time. I could feel a host of emotions as I went through the book. So spot on. There are a couple of very interesting terms as well which I encountered, and they stayed with me. And they've almost got institutionalized while chronicling the history of Ireland. One of them is called the Troubles, which is the war between the Republicans and Loyalists. There is a phase of troubles, I think, in the 20th century, where the Republicans and the Loyalists typically loyal to the British government. So this entire phase of unrest and conflict is termed troubles in the Irish parlance, if you like.
Okay.
Coming back to Anirudh, your point about fasting, I think it was a watershed and a very dim moment in the history of Ireland when a man called Bobby Sands died fasting in 1981. That was a critical milestone in the history of Ireland. The other milestone is two sisters who we are going to talk about, Dolores and Marion. They, along with a few of their IRA counterparts or colleagues, set about laying bombs in London. The year was 1973. So these are a few key milestones, if you like, which have shaped the history of Ireland in my very limited understanding. This is a copious account of what happened in Ireland in the 20th century up until today. One of the very key opponents, very prominent man who's now etched in my memory, Gerry Adams. He was the strategist of IRA. They would organize shootings, they would organize bombing skirmishes, they would have their own secret units. So IRA was all for an eye for an eye. We don't need you here, and we will fight.
Okay.
And if you notice, you would have seen the film Udham Singh. His armaments were supplied by an activist of IRA in London. So the book, the fascinating account of how Gerry Adams, being the chief strategy officer, if you like, of IRA, underwent a complete journey where he ends up denying the fact that he was a part of IRA, and he starts to parley with the British, starts to constitutionalize the Irish movement, and in the process betrays some very key of his comrades in the socialist party. So Gerry Adams, and now history will always be torn in terms of how to define Gerry. Tremendously erudite, eloquent man who could inspire, who was a tactician as well as a strategist, who could plan strikes, and who had the respect of all of IRA. In the latter years, up until, in fact, the 21st century, Patrick scribes beautifully about his transition and his retraction as a violent IRA. He'd never committed crimes physically, but he was the architect of all the key strikes, all the key events, fasting, for instance. There's some intriguing accounts of when the inmates, the IRA inmates, who were absolutely resolute people, steely grit, were on a fast. And purportedly, this is yet to be verified, Margaret Thatcher, who was the PM then, gave them an offer where they could then stop their fasting. So in effect, they wanted to have the liberty of wearing their own clothes and not being treated like normal prisoners, but political prisoners. So it was an ideological fight. It was an existential fight for those inmates. And Margaret Thatcher purportedly, allegedly sent them an offer saying, if you end your fast, then what we'll do is we will just allow and accept all your demands. Apparently, Gerry Adams refused that offer, and on the back of which 6 or 7, I think, is the number of the prisoners fasting died. And that was a defining moment in the history of Ireland because it gave them the visibility. But there's a lot of controversy on whether, he should have refused that offer from Thatcher and saved all those lives. This is a man who's heavily nuanced, to say the least, who's evolved as a personality, who's disowned the IRA in the later parts. And as a consequence, another big icon of Irish struggle, and I'm coming to the next character, Brendan Hughes. He becomes very bitter. They were the best of mates. They were together in the prison cell. Brendan carried out Gerry Adams' key missions towards the end, and he was incarcerated many a times, never gave up, always stood up and fought. And towards the end, he became quite disillusioned, and he openly opposed Gerry Adams' politics of disowning that he was ever a part of IRA, which actually killed many people. executed many people. So it's a fascinating account of multiple personalities looking at the progression very differently. Yeah.
So, Satyarth, you did mention that this is an account of the revolutionaries in that sense. We've talked about Jerry Adams, we've talked about Brenton as well. What I want to understand is, outside of these, and I partly know the answer, but for our audience as well, does this book also give an equal perspective of the victims of the IRA movement? I think one of them was Jean McConville, who and her family who really suffered through this. But does it also go into a lot more detail about the atrocities that IRA did? And does it account for the perspective of those who were victimized by this movement as well?
So, Anirudh, to your point, in equal measures. So the narrative is dangerously bold, candid, forthright, and neutral. So you talked about, so the book opens up on two accounts. One is the sister, which I'll come to later. The other one, so when you talk about Dolores and Marion Price's two sisters, who are iconic in the way they carry out their roles as a part of IRA. But Jane McConville, that's how the book starts. With her disappearance, the stage is set where she is a widow, a mother to many children, and how she's just taken one day in front of her children, and she never returns. So the book also chronicles the very tenuous, painful journey of the kids trying to figure out where the mom went. And there is almost, it's undoubtedly the fact that IRA took her and killed her. And then eventually her body is found 40 years after she was taken. So Anirudh, to your point, that in itself is a core theme of Patrick's writing. So he tries to weave the violence of IRA, obviously the incessant machinations of the British government, and the impact it had on common people, the violence. There were also many, many disappearances, like Jane's. So he talks about them. He talks about the pain. He talks about how the IRA also executed those disappearances. So now coming to the other two very significant protagonists, I think they are the Price sisters, Dolores and Marianne. They blow you away. Dolores is actually studied teaching. She comes from a family of IRA revolutionaries. And the ease with which she and her sister, Marianne, not only join the IRA but execute critical assignments like bombing in London, the nonchalance with which, and the complete devotion and commitment, and unfledgling commitment, I should say, to the cause, they carry out incredible assignments for IRA. They are well educated. Initially, they join peaceful marches, and then they get aligned to IRA. They formally join the IRA, and they're committed to IRA. This, so Say Nothing digs deep into their vicissitudinal lives. So from being executors of bombing to taking people across the fence who were so-called touts to be executed. Jean, and there is some debate to it, was one of them, and she was executed. Towards the end, there is mystery to who. There's huge intrigue built up in terms of whether Jerry Adams actually did order her to be killed, Jane McConville, and who carried out the execution. So it's almost like a mystery novel towards the end, and truth is stranger than fiction. And it does appear that Marianne shot Jean. And all these years into politics, Jerry Adams was tried for a murder. But, he could circumnavigate the inquiries and leverage his connections to be a free man. So it goes around in circles. It takes a very deep view of their journeys, which is nothing but fascinating. Also, it's absolutely heartbreaking how these people end up, whether it's Brendan or Dolores. They die very tragic, bitter deaths, and they bear the scars of all these years of, fasting, being in prison. There is a very poignant truth about Brendan, where he almost feels at home in his flat, having been incarcerated and imprisoned all these years. towards the end of his life. He was a man who would actually execute very critical assignments. He would bomb places. And towards the end, he becomes disillusioned with his friend Jerry Adams, who has disowned the IRA. And he becomes bitter, he becomes an alcoholic, and he's a recluse in his own room.
So it also gives that then but the perspective of the post-oppression trauma as well. So not just the time of the revolution, but the impact that this had on their post-oppression lives, the trauma that they went through, how they changed as people because of some of the actions that they had performed, and maybe living with those consequences in day-to-day life. The difficulties of that is what you're probably referring to as well.
Bitter, twisted, consigned to a destiny. These were heroes. These were people who didn't care about themselves. Some of them have such remarkable beliefs. Patrick deliberately studies how they end up and examines their lives at various junctures through these 40, 50 years. The Boston College had this program going, which is how this book starts again, where they started to chronicle and record confessions from the activists. And they were to be released after the death of most of these IRA activists, so to speak. The whole idea is to impart some or glean some lessons from the history and educate ourselves for the future. But
if I hadn't known that this is a non-fiction, it's an account of a true story and what happened in the lives of these 4 or 5 important characters, this was for me was a proper whodunit kind of murder mystery,
which is what strong.
It is. Exactly.
You hit the nail on the head, Kaustubh. This is like a murder mystery, except it's not fiction.
It's not fiction.
So there's a certain art of storytelling, and it has multiple plots, multiple strands of truth emanating at multiple junctures of the journey, and you might be settling into a bit of a narrative, and then there is a twist. So it's exactly what you said, Kaustubh. You won't be able to stop.
Wow.
Reading.
Satyarth, now as we focus on the book, I want to bring back the focus onto you and your habit of reading and how it has shaped you. What I'm going to do is throw across a set of questions, very simple questions, which are related to books, habit of reading, etc., etc. Any books or any type of books that you have read and reread and keep reading? Do you do your go-to book, just where you read multiple times?
I am a massive fan of an author called M.J. Akbar, whether it's Tinder Box in Pakistan or Blood Brothers. His artistry is inspirational. I've had the great fortune of working with the great MJ as well in my first stint when I was in Malaysia in the year 2000. And he would write editorials for the Asian Age while having lunch. An hour before the paper will go for publishing. So if you need inspiration for words or writing, it's M.J. Akbar, and I hope to share this with him as well. But he's my absolute guru. I look at from a distance and say, when I finally publish my book, and by the way, I had a stab at my own travels in a very self-deprecative, purportedly humorous way. So I've written some 8 chapters of mine, which I hope will see the light of the day at some point.
Okay, my second last question. Any lesser known book which has left a mark on you?
It's a book called The Romantics by Pankaj Mishra. And as the title suggests, it's an account of a fledgling student who obviously has a great gift, which is Pankaj Mishra.
Super. Okay, now my last question. Which is the next book that you're going to read?
So I've made a list of books on Ireland, funnily enough.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Satyarth. It's one of those few episodes where we talk about subjects which are a common passion and interest for myself and Kaustubh as well. So thank you for bringing this book up again.
Keep up the good work, guys. Keep illuminating, keep inspiring. You're doing brilliant work. And if there's anything I can do to be an advocate in my very limited capacity, I always will recommend the book Talkies.